Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Um, I'd like to just to start to introduce myself a bit. So I'm an anthropologist, Duncan Hart, and in Santa Fe, I direct the Institute for Tolerant Studies. We have a Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, which we do online, and we have programs. A learning channel on YouTube that we produce, and but my background is in anthropology, and this study actually began more than 50 years ago in Atlanta when I first went to Georgia State University as a graduate student who became an assistant professor of anthropology. And I was probably more of a graduate student then than a professor, but that's where everything started. When I first arrived to Atlanta, my offices at Georgia State in the anthropology department were just 5 blocks away from the offices for the Southern Christian Leadership Council. Now, for those of you who are younger, you might not know what that was. That was Dr. Martin Luther King's organization and his offices. It was just across the street, just about a block or so from the Ebenezer Baptist Church where he was the pastor. So when I arrived to Atlanta, my initial plan had actually been to do a study in the African American community. I prepared for that in graduate school at the University of Indiana. And so when I arrived, I volunteered at the SCLC. I met Dr. King in the process. I attended Ebenezer Baptist Church to hear him preach, and got to know people in the community. His home neighborhood, where the Ebenezer Baptist Church is called Sweet Auburn, and it's a district, a black district that's fairly close to downtown, really within walking distance of downtown. And I got to know people there, and in the process, I had the opportunity to, as I mentioned before, to meet Dr. King, and I mentioned to him the idea that I had of doing a study in the black community with religious life. His suggestion was the issues that we have are not in the black community, it's in the white community with the issue of racism. And he said, and it is involved with religion. So the suggestion very clearly was, don't do this here, do it in a white community. Within a matter of months, he was assassinated very, very shortly after this. And the contacts that I had begun to make in the black community were basically cut off at that point. There was, in Atlanta, there was already an existing issue of a barrier between whites and blacks. But with the civil rights movement, there was the custom that there were white people involved in civil rights things, so it wasn't too unusual. At the university, the black students at Georgia State University, by the way, now is predominantly black. When I went there, there were less than 100 black students. It was a very small, it had only shortly before had been integrated. The black students, for the first time when I arrived, wanted to organize a black student club, which they'd never had. There were 2 black faculty members, but they were older, and neither one of them wanted to be the faculty advisor. They had to have a faculty advisor to have a student club. And they came to me and asked if I would be the faculty advisor for the black student club, which I did with enjoying. And in those first months, in that first year, I was able to go out with them on the weekends. We would go to clubs. The best clubs in the city, of course, were on the black side of town, not up in the northeastern suburbs of Atlanta. So the Pink Pussycat and other clubs like that were, I could go to easily. But after Dr. King was assassinated, there literally was a wall that came down, that the existing sense of segregation became solidified more, and it was no longer welcome to be in the black community in the same kind of way. So I realized that his suggestion that this study should be done in a white community was obviously what I had to do. So curiously enough, literally across the railroad track, the Sweet Auburn and Ebenezer Baptist Church is just north of the Central Railroad that runs through middle Atlanta. You know Atlanta? Yeah, so you know, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Just south of the railroad tracks was an area that was called Cabbagetown. It was the mill workers for the Fulton Cotton Mill that had been established in Atlanta in 1881. And over the years had been the largest employer in Atlanta. And around the mill was a village of houses that the mill had built. They were the Mill Village houses. And it was a very distinct neighborhood. And so it met the what I was looking for, because I was looking for a community that had a distinct identity, that had an internal community life. And so Cabbagetown, which was the white working class community for the mill, was a good option. And literally, the Friendship Baptist Church in Cabbagetown is literally maybe a 15-minute walk from the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Sweet Auburn. These two Baptist churches had nothing to do with each other. One was a Southern Baptist Church, the Friendship Baptist Church, the white one. The Black Baptist Church was a progressive, civil rights-oriented Baptist church. The other was segregationist. A black person was not permitted in. You could not. There were ushers at the door. If a black person happened to show up, they would be turned away. They were not allowed in. So that was the context that I arrived to and finally started working in. So I give that as the background. And so let me start by talking about how I think we got to the point where we are today. And we'll eventually get into the kind of the analysis of what I think is happening. As the United States has been going through a rapid demographic and cultural change in recent decades, traditional economic, religious, and social patterns have been evolving as the country is in the process of transformation from its history in the 1700s and 1800s as a white, Protestant, self-contained republic to the 21st century, where we are now as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, pluralistic society, a world-leading democracy. Where we are today, we're not the republic that we were in the 1800s with a smaller population that was primarily WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. We're not there today. That has been combined also with what's happening in recent decades, which is an increased secularization in the society. And for the first time in American history, the majority of the population in America no longer goes to church on Sunday morning. The church membership has dropped below 50% just in these last few years. So as birth rates have dropped for the white European population, it is no longer reproducing itself. And immigration is primarily from non-European areas of the world. The US Census Bureau predicts that by 2045, the white population of America will become a minority population, So our country is in the process of shifting away from the white Christian dominance that was our past history in a century and so past. So that's part of the demographic change that I think is happening. Confronting these changes, the white Christian nationalist movement has been emerging in recent decades and becoming a dominant influence in American political life. Its goal is to maintain white control and the dominance of evangelical Christian values in American society. It includes establishing fundamentalist evangelical values as law in the United States and controlling major areas of American life, including media, education, business, and government. And I've studied Christian nationalism over the last 50 years, starting with that early study in Atlanta, and its core elements have remained basically the same. When I first started in Atlanta in the late 60s and 70s, the white Christian nationalism at that point was beginning as a backlash to the combined loss of white privilege in the Jim Crow South, the outlawing of religious values like prayer and Bible reading in schools. So the initial elements that triggered this 50 years ago were the outlawing of segregation and the outlawing of the public use of prayer and Bible reading in public spaces. In 2017, when I heard the Unite the Right marchers in Charlottesville shouting, "Jews will not replace us," I felt a haunting sense of déjà vu because I'd heard that before in Atlanta. After the 1917 rally, I came back to the study of contemporary Christian nationalism that I'd already seen before, and I recognized many of the same grievances that I had heard in Georgia. I found ample literature on the macro level on the political right, but I did not find ethnographic information on the micro level about the lives of people who were the emerging Christian nationalists. And that's research I had done in Atlanta. I had lived literally, in anthropology, we do what's called participant observation. You're supposed to go and live in the community and you participate in everything. You visit with families, you go to family events, you go to weddings, you go to church, you go to, you're there, if possible, on a daily basis, talking with people and just hearing what's going on in the community and recording all of this. And you record and you record and you record until you begin to see patterns. I was in Cabbagetown for most of 4 years, recording information, interviewing people, getting their thoughts. And so I'd lived that experience, I'd seen it. I had made this ethnographic study in the white evangelical working class neighborhood of Cabbagetown, where people thought America was falling apart morally and economically. They wanted to pressure the government toward what they believed were the Christian foundations of the country. And at the time, I thought I was observing a local cultural phenomenon in a working class community, which I thought was simply reacting to the end of the Jim Crow era, because literally I was there shortly after shortly after all the civil rights legislation, all of that, and people still were angry about the loss of white privilege and Christian values, what they saw as a loss of Christian values that had been happening during that time period. So I thought what I was seeing was just a local phenomenon. I did not have the vision at the time that this was going to become a national phenomenon. And only later would I recognize that Cabbagetown was one matrix of the Christian national movement, and I had been there and, in a sense, had accidentally documented their grievances in that early process. Cabbagetown was a neighborhood of largely Scotch-Irish people who had come from the Appalachian Piedmont to find jobs in Atlanta. And when the rise of globalism led to the stagnation and the dismantling of broad sectors of the American industrial base, the Southern cotton mill industry became anachronistic. And a century of working class growth imploded as America's great period of low-skilled industrial work came to an end. So the simultaneous loss of white legal privileges and job losses from globalism produced a double cultural and economic crisis. As people demanded redress, evangelical preachers became their spokesmen, arguing that the problem was religious, not economic. They argued that a return to the nation's Christian roots was the path to the revitalization of white America as they knew it. So if we become Christians and we're good enough, it'll bring back the jobs. This was kind of like, there's a version of religious life that anthropologists have studied, which are called revitalization movements. And I don't know if any of you have heard of these, but the cargo cults that occur in the Pacific and other, among Native Americans when things were, the ghost dance religion came as a revitalization movement, for example, in the 1890s. So when societies go into crisis, there is this phenomenon called, where religion comes in as a revitalization way of restoring what has been lost. So at the beginning, that was what I thought I was beginning to see in Cabbagetown. And in a sense, that's what Christian nationalism is. It is a revitalization movement to restore what people see as having been lost. So I was getting to know people of Cabbagetown in that double crisis. As I visited families, I heard the grievances about how their lives were being affected by the political and cultural direction of the country. Some preachers were predicting that, literally predicting an impending apocalypse, arguing that Christians had to prepare to fight. I mean, I literally heard this in sermons in churches while I was there, that Christians had to prepare to fight for their lives and their religion, predicting that Jews and foreigners were about to take over the country and that they would outlaw Christianity altogether and take away the Bible. Now, this sounds kind of fantastic, but those are literally the words that I was hearing and that I recorded. I observed how the sense of disenfranchisement combined with Christian entitlement that led to outrage as white evangelicals adapted the ideology of Christian nationalism. Although those evangelical preachers probably intended their denunciation of moral decline in family and government to improve society, and I believe they were serious in this, but the repercussions of their blaming blacks and Jews and foreigners for the ills that they were experiencing turned malevolent, as we know more recently in the attacks that have occurred on Jewish synagogues, on black communities, and we've seen how this can turn badly. I was surrounded by people who believed in an anthropomorphic God sitting on a throne in heaven with streets paved with gold. And again, if you haven't heard this, I'm literally quoting from things that I heard. And they thought they were doing God's will to save America for Christianity. Because again, this is revitalization movement. It's a process to save America. The genuineness and the sincerity of the people showed me how the cultural environment in which people live can bend their best intentions and their will toward the social and historical influences around them. I was a part participant in that world, observing and documenting life events, conversations, and everyday life. That meant long afternoons of sitting on the front porch of a house, listening to a man talk about his work at the mill or his hatred of black people, all the time intermingled with him playing country music on the harmonica and asking if I recognized the tunes. He would play something and he'd say, "Do you know what that one is?" Then at the same time repeating the process later on, sitting with his wife, in which she would talk about her religious beliefs and her experiences in church, intermingled with her telling me about recent events in the neighborhood, because I could always be kept up on who's doing what and what's happening there, the stories. After World War II, life in Cabbagetown had begun to change as the federal government initiated mandates on integration, civil rights, religious pluralism, and women's rights that shook the cultural foundations of this community and led to a white backlash fueled by Christianity, Christian belief itself. It was white supremacy, not the one of swastikas and neo-Nazis, but it was one of belief in Christian superiority and the evangelical exceptionalism, the idea that Christianity was exceptional. It was the religion, which led to being opposed, and that led to people being opposed to the pluralism of democracy as a number of non-Christians and non-whites gained the vote. So the suspicion of democracy is coming because gradually whites saw themselves as losing the dominant vote. Civil rights gave blacks the vote. So democracy began to come into question. The transformative decades between Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and Roe versus Wade in 1973 ended the era of segregation and the hegemony of Protestant Christianity while weakening white privilege. And I would like for us to look at the, oops, did we get it? Yeah. The transformative decades that I was just mentioning. This was a real turning point in American society, and we have to use this as the reference as to what was to come later. So look at this astounding series of events. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education ended racial segregation in schools. Now there was a gap of 8 years, but the next one's come very quickly. 1962, Ingle versus Vitale ruled that devotional prayer in schools was unconstitutional. The next year, 1963, Abington School District versus Shrimp ended Bible reading in schools. 1964, Civil Rights Act increased rights to women and black people. 1965, women voting rights outlawed racial discrimination in voting. 1965, again, same year, Hart and Geller Act opened immigration to Jews, Asians, and others, which had been strictly contained and limited since 1924, when the 1924 Immigration Act essentially cut off immigration from Jews, from Catholics, and from Asians. They set it up the way that they set up a series of quotas that distinctly limited these people from coming in. So one of the problems for Jews, of course, was when, as the Holocaust was beginning, they could not come into the United States because of those restrictions that had been in the 1924 law. You might know the case of the ship, was it the St. Louis? That was one of the cases that had appeared on our shores. It was not allowed to land. The 900 people on board had to go back, and most of them went into concentration camps, and many died. We had many cases like that where, but in 1965, that law was changed, and immigration was open, and we started having a much more open immigration process in this country. 1968, the Fair Housing Act outlawed racial discrimination in housing codes. People in Cabbagetown were terrified that they were going to have black neighbors. This was a major issue. 1968, also, the Hays Code, which had controlled morality standards in movies and in TV, was dropped. The Hays Code had all kinds of things like women had to be fully dressed in movies and in TV. It was after this code was dropped, we finally got Barbarella and James Bond and other things where dress became totally different. The Hays Code required things. You weren't supposed to show bedrooms very much, but if you did, it had to be twin beds, and people could not be seen together in bed. A whole series of kisses. If there was a kiss, it was limited to 2 or 3 seconds. It couldn't be any longer. There were these very precise rules about how things could be done. So if you go back and look at movies before the Hays Code, you'll see them looking very differently from the movies immediately afterwards, or television programs. Then we get to the highlight of this transformative decade, 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment that would give guaranteed a constitutional amendment for equal rights for women, and of course 1973, Roe versus Wade. These two were a double whammy, 1972 and 73, galvanized the Christian coalition against the changes that had been coming. And as we know, the ERA was stopped by the Christian coalition. And of course, Roe versus Wade took 50 years, but it eventually was also overturned. So the people of Cabbagetown had experienced within one generation of these changes what they perceived as a perfect storm of attacks on their religious practices and their status as white people and as evangelical Christians. People saw this as an assault on their culture and their traditions, and I think part of this goes back to the whole idea that the federal government is coming in and changing your traditions and your life can be traced back in the South, partly back to the Civil War, where the federal government came in and imposed a new rule on the South and on its traditions. And people were still regularly talking about the Civil War, and it was a living memory. They saw the Southern white evangelical religious system as God-given and the absolutely true path for humankind, and the legal changes during these transformative decades had not only ignored but destroyed their religious life as they understood it. They were victims. God's plan for humanity was a victim. And their protests gave root to the politics of grievance that would come to reshape American political life and become what we know as Christian nationalism. This very early version of making America great again, and that was a concept they used. This is not Donald Trump's term, by the way. This was a term that was commonly used there. We need to rescue America and make it great again, and we make it great again by making it Christian again. And that was to become the root, of course, that was to reshape American politics. This early version of making America great again merged racism, religious rage, and the belief in Christian superiority to shape political opinion. When I heard people in Cabbagetown calling for a white Christian America in the early 1970s, it was a harbinger of what was to come. They felt the Supreme Court had destroyed their traditional way of life, ordering blacks and whites to attend school together, outlawing prayer and Bible reading in schools, all of which they took as an attack on their religion. Civil rights legislation was making blacks equal to whites, and the final straw, of course, was the Equal Rights Amendment in the Roe versus Wade. In the evangelical heyday of that decade, by the way, the 1970s was the evangelical peak of religion in the United States. The evangelical churches added more members in 1970 than they ever had before and ever have since. 1970s was a peak of evangelical prominence. It was a very interesting time period. Billy Graham had mass crusades in major cities around the country, and including one in Atlanta. And so it was a time of major evangelical move forward. To the evangelical people of Cabbagetown, making America great was actually a code word referring to the following issues, which start with Christian entitlement. People saw Christianity as being superior to other religions, and the United States should be a Christian country. Racism. White people were superior to black people, and I heard this all the time. and integration would destroy the integrity of America. Anti-feminism. They feared that women's liberation would destroy the role of women as the moral center of the family, causing the family structure to disintegrate in the United States. Anti-government. The federal government was non-Christian and had negated their Christian values. And there were repeated stories after stories after stories about how the federal government had done things wrong. So they wanted to cut the power of the federal government. And we see this argument that's a core part of this between states' rights and the federal government, which disenfranchisement. Government did not represent them, but they did not feel that they had the power to change it. So a strong feeling of disenfranchisement. Conspiracy replacement theory that we've seen a bit of already. Preachers spoke of a xenophobic conspiracy by communist Jews and other non-Christians to replace them and outlaw the Bible and Christianity itself. Just as black preachers had been the primary leaders in the civil rights movement, white preachers became the leaders in the opposition to the reforms of the transformative decades. They denounced the federal government for the mandates they saw as overturning their religious rights. And the evangelical paradigm led to a sense of Christian rights and entitlement, a culturing system in which people share the premise that the American way of life and Christianity, the Christianity associated with it, are exceptional and should be given priority in national policy decisions. Preachers in Cabbagetown argued for the United States being ruled by Christian leaders according to evangelical values. Was this a call for theocracy? It sounded a bit like it. They also referenced Hitler and Stalin as leaders who had gotten things done, which sounded like a call for autocracy that could be menacing to non-Christians. Hidden in those messages, and these were things I heard in the churches, by the way, being preached from the pulpits, hidden in those messages was the call for a strong man, and again, I'm not saying this from now, that's what I heard then, a strong man who could eliminate existing church-state order to establish fundamentalist Christian values as the governing paradigm. Repeated calls for a strong man who could impose this. I heard preachers and people in Cabbagetown in their protests about the changing world that they were experiencing, and they embraced the vision of restoring America to its greatness as a Christian nation, and at the same time, restoring white people as the backbone of the nation. As Christian nationalism was being gentrified and gone mainstream over the last half century, many of those goals have been achieved. ERA and abortion rights were stopped. The Supreme Court decisions on segregation and Bible reading and prayer in public schools were avoided by, and I only realized this in later research, the dramatic expansion in private academies and private Christian schools that spread, especially across the South. More than 25,000 private schools emerged within a matter of like 10 years after the 1960 laws went into effect. So they got around prayer and writing, integration, the issue of prayer and Bible reading in the schools, simply by not going to public schools. They just set up tens of thousands of private schools all across, especially across the South. Let me catch up here. On the subject of integration and civil rights for black people, Claude Workman, one of the people that I interviewed in the community, who was a cotton mill worker in his 30s, told me, and these are his words, they haven't asked the white man. They don't give a damn about the white man. It seems that way. They know just what the Negro tells them. I'm using Negro as the cleaned up word here because the N word was regularly used. And there's been multitudes and more multitudes of things done against Negroes that shouldn't have been done. They've been stumped on, they've been strung up to trees, but I tell you, just how many could you or I find that should be hung to trees? Actually, it would be a justice to the community to hang them to trees. No, I'm not going to get out there and be part of hanging nobody to a tree, but there's plenty of them that I do know that should be white and black. That night, as we were sitting in his living room talking, and it became practice for me to carry a small tape recorder all this time. I was recording these conversations, and I told people ahead of time what I was doing, so that I was getting their stories. I wanted to get their story to tell it, and so I'd ask people permission, and they regularly gave me permission to record a conversation. It became standard practice. And the amazing people sometimes ask me later, how did you get people to tell you all these things? And the thing is, they wanted to tell their story. Nobody was asking them their point of view. They felt disenfranchised. And when someone would show up and say, I want to hear your story, I want to hear what you're thinking, people were very open about talking about it. And so that night, as we were sitting in his living room talking, we were sitting in front of each other. He was smoking a Camel cigarette. He laid it down on the table beside him, which he soon forgot. And I watched as he went on talking, as the Camel slowly burned itself into an ash, leaving the black mark on the table where it had been, and he had totally forgotten about it. That black mark on the table was going to be there for the rest of that table's life. In the ceiling above Workman was a black hole where he had shot one night with his .38 Special when he was, quotes, out of his head drunk. It was the same gun that he carried around for days and days looking for the black man that his wife had reported had raped her. He was literally looking for the black man with his gun and threatening. Cecil Smith, another mill worker, told me this, in quotes. Let's see, I think we have. The Lord isn't pleased with it. Now you take this little old mixing of race, the race of people. God created this world, even to the largest and smallest little insect. He made them exactly like he wanted them to stay. And today these people get out there and mix and mingle, and oh, it's awful. I just believe he, God, ain't going to let it go on too much longer. Born to lose was also an expression that was used by some men in the community. And the starkness of the phrase was the masculinity of disenfranchisement. They had lost on the issues of segregation, Bible reading, prayer in the schools, and they feared losing to the women's liberation movement. This might be a surprise to you. I mean, what does women's liberation have to do with Christian nationalism? But it was a key part that people talked about. They had already lost and had nothing more to lose. One of Elvis Presley's popular songs at the time that was regularly heard in the community was the song Trouble. And let me give you some of the lyrics of this. By the way, the local tavern in Cabbagetown was called Quit Your Belly Aching, which was always kind of funny. Quit Your Belly Aching Bar. I would go there to listen to what people had to say and to listen to the music that they were listening to, and this was one of the ones that was popular. The lyrics are, if you're looking for trouble, you came to the right place. Just look right in my face. I was born standing up and talking back. I'm evil, evil, evil as can be. I don't take no orders from no kind of man. So that was part of the attitude of this born to lose kind of macho attitude of disenfranchisement. I may be disenfranchised, but I'm a tough guy, and nobody can beat me. Presley's song Trouble was like an anthem to rough masculinity. Johnny Cash also sang songs to that kind of thing, and especially his famous album, Folsom Prison Blues, talks about being a prisoner in jail and the life that's involved there. Another very popular song in town, in that community, was one called 16 Tons, written by about a miner, a coal miner. And it says, but it's really a working man's song. It says, if you see me coming, better step aside. A lot of men didn't, a lot of men died. One fist of iron, the other of steel. If the right one don't get you, then the left one will. This sense of tough masculinity and disenfranchisement inherent in the born to lose attitude was one of the building blocks of white nationalism and its cousin Christian nationalism, which reinforced the belief in the need to restore America to the greatness it had been, of making America great again. These men understood strength and a leader who projected strength. I regularly heard that it would take a strongman ruler to establish the old order for them, and they wanted a man who had the strength that they did not have and who could exercise it for them. The Born to Lose mantra provided the basis for rebellion against governing authority, which they felt no longer represented them. So here we get into the distrust of the federal government again. Those who had this Born to Lose tattoo, many of them had the tattoo literally Born to Lose on their arm. They felt they had nothing to lose in the governance because it didn't represent them. Since they were born to lose, they did not have any commitment to the existing order, which is a very important point. There was no commitment to the existing order. During the sermon one Sunday morning, a Baptist preacher was saying this, and here we can see his quote. Again, this is a recorded sermon. The problem today is that we're losing the children to the devil. Negroes and whites are together, and it ain't right. It's the communists who are behind it. The communists now are not talking about Russians and Chinese. They're talking about American communists, which they define as the liberal elite and Jews, basically. So when you hear the communist term here, it's because remember, this is right after the McCarthy era when they were arresting so many Jews as communists, and the liberal elite in Hollywood and so on. So that's what they're referring to. It's the communists who are behind it. They are bringing about the degeneration of our youth. Television has been a damnation to our children. They see all the sinful songs and dances and the long hair of the singers, and they go out and they do the same thing. All of these kids that hang out on the street can't be locked up anymore. He wants to lock them up. And you know why? It's because everything is corrupt, from the president to every office in the land. The kids dancing is bad because they get through, then they get in the car and they are alone together, and pretty soon they're in a motel room. Sex is taking over. The devil is taking over. The communists said they would take over the United States without ever firing a shot, and they're going to do it by taking over our kids. And he continues, and I continue quoting. Let's see, I think I have to. What can be done? Hitler and Stalin did something. There are more communists in the United States today than there have ever been, and they're all armed. And they have a plan to kill the President of the United States and take over every high official within 15 minutes when they get the signal. I'm quoting this stuff. You know, I couldn't have imagined to make it up. This is a Baptist preacher standing in the pulpit on a Sunday morning. This is the sermon. So this was replacement theory, that the Jews and other non-white Christians are going to take over the country and replace Christians. From those early grievances and protests, evangelicals have become a driving force in national politics, providing an electoral edge in the US Congress, and helping elect 4 out of the 6 presidents between 1980 and 2016, between Ronald Reagan and 2016, and plus influencing the shape of the Supreme Court. The Christian nationalism that I observed in Baptist and Holiness churches in Cabbagetown was soon to coalesce with tens of thousands of other evangelical churches across the country, and there are tens of thousands of them. Reverend Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority and televangelist Pat Robertson emerged as national spokesman for this religious political movement with millions of followers. And Jerry Falwell was a very close friend with Ronald Reagan, by the way. And they knew each other from California, and that continued. At the Republican National Convention in 1980, Ronald Reagan said, and let me see, I think we have a slide on that also. Yeah, there we go. For those who've abandoned hope, we will restore hope, and we will welcome them into the great national crusade to make America great again. Now, Ronald Reagan was the one who actually made this his campaign slogan, to make America great again. Later, more recently, it's been borrowed, of course, by Trump. That was a key slogan in his 1980 campaign when he won the presidency. His positive message of America as a light on the hill for democracy contrasts with the more negative recent message of grievance and victimhood. Reagan, by the way, was a devout Christian. He grew up in a Christian environment. He went to a Christian college, Eureka College, and he initially considered being a preacher before he became an actor. Of course, later he got into politics, and he was kind of a preacher in politics anyway. But his original goal was he was going to be a preacher. The hidden message for evangelicals was, in Reagan's message, was the return to white Christian America. And the curious thing in the 1980 election, even though he was running against Jimmy Carter, who was a Baptist Sunday school teacher, and the incumbent president, Reagan outdid him in the religious messaging. Reagan got to the evangelicals that Carter was never able to do. He gave them recognition, and they in turn helped him elect him president. The evangelical discontent at that point was a political plum, and the binding element that led to the coalition between evangelicals and Republicans. In recent decades, Christian nationalism has spawned a series of ultra-nationalist Christian organizations, and some of them, let me see if I have a slide on that. Yeah, here they are. Some of those organizations, the Christian nationalism is not one thing. It's made up of a whole series of organizations. Some of the important ones are Ziglag, which is an organization of wealthy owners of major businesses that are devout Christians. One of them is Hobby Lobby, that you might know about, the Green family, the Uline family that owns Uline office supplies, Jockey, some other corporations like that are a part of this Ziglag movement. The Alliance Defending Freedom, the Family Research Council, the First Liberty Institute, the American Center for Law and Justice are other Christian nationalist organizations. So at one point I sat down in the 1970s when all this was starting, I tried to make a calculation of how many evangelical churches there might have been in the United States. Now this was a peak of evangelical activity. And adding together the Baptist and the Holiness and the Pentecostals and all those, I came up with a figure. There must have been approximately 100,000 evangelical preachers. Think of that number, 100,000 in all over the 50 states. Now, a lot of these were small churches, but it was this vast number who are giving voice to the victimhood and the post-Jim Crow Christian grievances that we've been seeing. So 50 years later, as Christian nationalism continues to address the same issues, but there's more of a crisis now because of the dramatic decline in church attendance. Membership in mainline churches today, from 1970s, has dropped in half. membership in mainline churches has dropped in half. And the members who do remain attend church less frequently. The fact that younger people are abandoning organized religion in significant numbers has been a factor in this decline. In the last 20 years, the percentage of Americans identifying as Christians has dropped below 50% for the first time in American history. For the first time in American history, fewer than half of the people identify as Christian in this country. Today, approximately 15% of Americans are evangelical Protestants, 15% are mainstream Protestants, and 15% Catholics. Each one of those 15% numbers represents about 50 million people. Although the 1970s were a peak of evangelical success in the last century, I think we have some more numbers here. The Pew Research Center's 2022 report on religion in the United States found that 65% identify as, these are evangelicals, 65% of evangelicals identify as Christian nationalists, which is more than 32 million people, as you can see here. 81% of evangelicals believe that the founders meant for the U.S. to be Christian and that it should be Christian today. 48% of them believe that the Bible, and this to me is even more astounding, 48% believe the Bible should be the primary guidestone for establishing national legislation more than public opinion. So the Bible should be the guidestone for law. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest evangelical group in America, and it's a major advocate of Christian nationalism. Southern Baptists, the other major evangelical groups are Pentecostal and Holinist groups. The Southern Baptists have more than 15 million members, 47,000 churches, making them the largest of evangelical churches. But they are less than 1/4 of the overall evangelical population. So the Southern Baptists have been leaders in this Christian nationalism movement. They are historically an all-white denomination, and today continue being 85% white, only 6% black membership. And as the title suggests, 81% of their members are in southern states. In the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, they voted 77% in the first and 78% in the second, supporting the Republican candidate for president. So overwhelming support for Christian nationalist candidates. So I'm coming to a close here. There was a slide I should, well, you've already heard these numbers, so we won't go over it again. The Christian nationalist position today is arguing for a national outlawing of abortion, making prayer and Bible reading and displays of the Ten Commandments public. We've seen this happening already in Oklahoma and some of the other states. School curricula should reflect Christian teachings. The Oklahoma case is requiring the Bible to be taught as a part of the curriculum in public schools. Laws should reflect biblical principles, need for a strongman leader to impose Christian values, and there are a whole series of other very specific details that they're arguing for, but one of them that was curious that I thought to include here was that 80% of movies and TV that have a P or a PG rating should reflect Christian values. So the American crisis of sacred versus secular has never been resolved in our country. And the current Christian nationalist movement seems to be a continuation of that long, unresolved conflict between church and state, secular and sacred. When I first heard the argument to impose fundamentalist Christian values a half century ago, as I mentioned before, I thought it was a marginal religious dogma. But I now realize that what I observed was the seedling that was to become an oak tree. And as we close today, the question that I leave with you is whether this is a religious and cultural movement that has the potential of being a pivotal movement in reshaping our American society, or exactly how do we understand this particular movement. And let me stop at this point and thank you for your patience.